Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So recently, Antonia and I have been going through some of the projects over the past several months and over the past year, and we've been evaluating whether they have been successful or have been challenged and not successful. And we've been just kind of categorizing like, okay, that was great. That project went off without a hitch. We got that done. Man, this project didn't happen. Why didn't this happen? In fact, not only did it not happen, it maybe went on for months, maybe half a year in some cases, some of the projects we've wanted to get done in the past. And so just through casual conversation over the past couple of weeks, we, in the conversations, had a little mini model emerge that we've been now using casually. We thought we'd talk about, unpack on today's show, and let you get a glimpse of this little model, and maybe you can help us expand upon it. Maybe you can use it in your life, or you can think about how how it can be tweaked or improved upon. I think this is something we could crowdsource with you listening, basically. And this is really not designed to be able to get things done. So the goal of this little model we came up with is more a diagnostic tool. It's an understanding tool almost in post, after the fact, to go, okay, what was missing here? What were the elements missing? And we kind of did it in that framework where we ask a question: if a project doesn't happen, what was missing? And we've determined there's what we can determine right now through conversation is there's 5 general elements, and I'll just list them and then we can unpack that and talk about it, Antonia. But basically, we've determined there's basically 5 components you have to have in place for something to happen. Whether you're delegating something to a team or whether you're doing it yourself, you have to have permission to do that thing. You have to have clarity about what you're doing. You have to have motivation, maybe desire. We're kind of going back and forth whether it's motivation or desire. We can talk a little bit about that. You have to have skill built, or you have to know how to do it. And then you have to have resource, the actual resource, whether that's energy, time, the tools you need, whatever those are. So permission, clarity, motivation, skill, and resource. And as we talk, we can't really think of anything else that comes up. So let's say I delegate a project to somebody and they aren't able to complete it. I ask myself as a leader, I go, okay, what were they missing? Were they missing permission? Were they missing clarity? Were they missing motivation? Were they missing skill? Or were they missing resource? Or maybe a combination of those things. And it's a great diagnostic tool to zoom in quickly and maybe understand the system that's running and understand where things went off the rails.
I think it's not a bad pre-diagnostic.
Sure.
I mean, when
checklist.
something... Yeah, exactly. Like when something goes off the rails and it didn't get done the way that you wanted it to get done, or in that timeline, or maybe you're in the middle of something that you're struggling with as a project. It's a great diagnostic tool for those situations, but I think that I'm going to start using it before I enter a project to make sure that I have as many of those 5 factors as I can before I start the project, so that it doesn't end up in that sort of project purgatory, which is, I think, what happens when you're missing one of these 5 components. So I think this isn't a bad pre-diagnostic, but I also think that it works better if you are currently in a churn. In that churn of, why can't I get the last little bit done? And I think probably in the timeline of a project, what started out, you might have had all 5 in the beginning, but the circumstance might change based on your personality or based on just the situation itself. Like at the beginning of a project, you might have a bunch of resource to burn. You might have maybe gotten some capital for a project and you've got the money, the money resource that you needed, but the project went on longer than you were anticipating, and all of a sudden your monetary capital resource has dried up and now you're missing one of the 5. Now what do? You got to be resourceful. Or I think desire is a big one. As an EP myself, as an ENTP, but as just a general EP, we're famous for being really into a project in the beginning, but by the time you get to the 40 to 60% mark, your motivation is starting to wane, and by the time you get to 80 or 90%, it's gone, right? You're wishing somebody will come save you. Whereas another person might, depending on their personality type, might hesitate to begin projects or have the beginning of the project be very difficult because maybe you're an IJ type and you're lacking what you think is enough clarity to begin the project because you need to build more clarity around what you need to do. But then as you get into motion, clarity now is emergent. So I think this will be different depending upon the individual that's interacting with this model. But I do think that going through these 5 different elements and asking yourself what's missing if you can't seem to get it accomplished allows you to then go, okay, well then how do I get that node in the system handled?
Yeah, and there might be more things that this list needs to include. I can't think of them off the top of my head, and we've been talking about that for several weeks. There might be a difference between desire and motivation, for example, because I might desire something in my life but have zero motivation to make it happen. So I don't know if those things are totally conflated. We put them at the same level, but those might be able to be broken into two separate things potentially.
Or like a subcategory. Desire could be a subcategory of motivation because it's one strategy to motivate. You want to just go through these 5 and just kind of riff on them a little bit and see what we can come up with and idea generate, and then at the end go, hey, what does everybody else think and what do you think we missed?
Yeah, and I also just as we get ready to do that, I think that certain polarities, judging polarities, at least from what I can tell just on the surface, look at this, cluster and focus on these probably. Like, for example, I bet you that extroverted feeling and introverted thinking polarity, so FETI polarity, whether you're a TP or an FJ in the Myers-Briggs system, you're going to have this as your judging polarity to make decisions. And you, if you have this polarity, would probably be focused more on clarity and skill. Those are the two things you'd probably would occupy like your first bit of attention. And you might not think in terms of motivation or resource or even permission because you're so focused on skill and clarity. Whereas somebody on the extroverted thinking, introverted feeling, so the TFI polarity, so these are going to be the TJs and the FPs in the Myers-Briggs system, might be more focused on motivation and resource, right? That extroverted thinking, introverted feeling, the motivation, resource, the interplay between those things might be the case. So as we talk about this, you listening, depending on how you're wired, will probably resonate with some of these over others. They're like intuitively or instinctually something you focus on. And then the others might be more of a, maybe not a blind spot, something that's not priority for you. It's almost like, oh yeah, that'll take care of itself. Again, depending on how you're wired, mileage may vary. But let's talk about it. So permission. And one of the things that we always talk about here at Personality Hacker is this idea of permission. We talk about it in personal growth. We talk about it in becoming the best version of yourself, in looking to excel in your relationships, in your work. Like, permission is one of those things we often talk about. Antonia's got this great line, a brilliant line, where she says permission is something we don't know we needed until we got it. And then we're like, wow, where has this permission been my entire life? Like, why was I holding back from giving myself permission to do this thing for so long or be this thing for so long? It's so refreshing to finally have it in your life. So permission is really a good place to start, because I think everybody tends to back away from giving themselves permission to be their truest or best self in their life.
Yeah, and permission is a wily one. It's squirmy, and it doesn't reveal itself to you until after you've gotten it, if you lack it, which is why, thank you for quoting me, by the way. It's kind of a surreal experience to be quoted in front of yourself. I was like, yeah, you're right. I do say that. The line of you didn't know you needed it until you got it. It's almost one of those things that you didn't even know it was a thing until all of a sudden you have it. It's almost as if when you don't have permission, it's not like a gaping hole where you're like, something should go there. What's the thing that goes there? Let me just go find it and put it in there. It's almost like it doesn't reveal that there's an empty space there at all. Your mind edits the whole concept out. And I think it's because when we lack permission, it's because we've handed that power over to somebody else and they're walking around with it. Like, they have our permission with them, and we didn't know we handed it off to them. And that's one of the reasons why it's just this big, it's this big edited space inside of us. When we grab our permission and grab our power back and grab our personal, permission is basically another word for, sovereignty and agency. It's the gift you give yourself to go, you know what? I can go ahead and go for that thing and it's going to be fine, right? I'm allowed to do that as a person. I can go for that thing. And so because permission is so wily, when we start a project and we lack permission, we might not know that about ourselves. We might not know that that's the thing that's missing. And oftentimes, the permission isn't directly tied with the project itself. It's tied with the implication of the project. So it's not that I don't have permission to say, I don't know, like we're in the middle of a major project where we're really making the discovery kits just amazing. Like, that's our goal. So we're going to make these discovery kits incredible. And we're in the middle of this project. And my permission may not be, or lack of permission rather, might not be tied to the actual recording and editing and uploading into the membership site and letting everybody know and marketing and letting everybody know this thing exists. It might have nothing to do with that. It might actually have to do with, if I complete this, well, then now I'm free to move on to something else that might be scary to me. And I don't have permission to do the next thing that's coming down the pike. And I'm actually trying to avoid that. And so because I'm trying to avoid the next thing in line, then I'm going to play out this project for way past its shelf life. Or what if I roll this out and I'm a horrific failure and nobody likes it? Well, do I have permission to fail? Or what if I roll this out and it's amazing and I get all this positive feedback, but now I have to contend with some sort of, self-evaluation that doesn't match whatever insecurities I'm currently harboring. So do I have permission to succeed? So there's a bunch of things around permission that makes it so squirmy and wily. And that's the introspective part of every project. I personally think that literally everything we do in our life requires just a hair's breadth of introspection, if not a dump truck full of introspection, depending upon the thing. And I feel like every project, regardless of whether or not it's completely like materialistic and completely secularized and everything about it seems, like as far away from anything that has any sort of spiritual or woo-woo connotation, even those require us to be honest with ourselves and have some introspection about why we're doing this thing, what we're doing, why we're doing it, what does it mean about us, what does it say about us to ourselves. And then when you have that little bit of dialogue or conversation, you'll know whether or not there's something's missing. This idea that it's usually manifests in like an almost an incomprehensible holding back. Not incomprehensible. What's the word? Not indescribable. I'm looking for the word. It's unaccounted for. It's an unaccounted for holding back. And so if you got the rest of the 4 of the 5 down, right? You've got the other 4 that follow permission down, and everything else seems to be coming up roses. Then usually if you, for some reason, are getting stalled out in a project, it's usually around permission someplace, either directly linked to the project or linked to something after it or linked to your image of yourself or something that lives in there. And
I would add to that, permission is always self-permission. So even like I'm looking at this little model here from the framework, I'm doing from 2 frameworks, the framework of me as a person trying to accomplish something and all the things I have to have in place. I have to have permission in place, clarity, your resource, all this stuff. And I'm also looking at it from a leadership or management standpoint. So from a leadership standpoint, the people that I am leading or that we're working with, whatever project that is, and you might have people you manage, you listening, right? The people you lead also have to have permission to accomplish the thing or the project, but you cannot grant them that permission. Like you can grant them permission like structurally, like, okay, at our company, you're allowed to do X, Y, Z, or at this project, or this nonprofit, or this cause-based organization, you can do X, Y, Z. You can say that, but they still have to find that permission themselves. So a good leader then helps that person that you're helping to lead discover that permission in themselves. And unless you can help them discover that permission, they probably won't feel a full sense of it, and that's going to hijack them. And you're going to go, what? Like, I gave them everything they needed. I gave them permission. Well, they had to find it within themselves. And if they can't find it within themselves, you're going to see a little bit of a holdback from my perspective. Like, this is what I've noticed for the permission piece.
Yeah, I think employees or members on a team that have an objective that they're like the intent is that they accomplish that from somebody who they're working for, like an employer. I think that you really see this lack of permission come up in what is usually called a C player. So A players are the ones who, like they're in the right seat in the bus and they're just kicking ass and taking names. And B players are usually A players that are in the wrong seat. They're doing really well, but for some reason they're not quite they're just not rocking and rolling. And it's usually because they're A players that are in the wrong place. But then there's like C players. And the way that I heard a definition of C players is C players are extremely good at keeping their jobs. That's like their core competency. So they never do quite excellent at anything, but they're always really good at just doing enough to keep their job. And I feel like most of those people, it's a massive issue with permission. Usually it's some sort of like, and it could be motivation too, but oftentimes it's tied in with how they see themselves. And it's not necessarily that like it's the employer's job now to, I don't get them through coaching so they feel better about themselves so they show up better. Like, if a person isn't performing, then you can do with them as you need to. But that's usually what happens with C players, is that they're just lacking some sort of self-esteem permission that would help them become the A player or the B player if they're in the wrong place. That also can happen. But to become the best version of themselves is usually a permission issue.
So the second thing on the list is clarity. And I would look at clarity to expand upon it in a couple of ways. One is the vision of what you want to accomplish, like this bigger picture. It could be a visual picture or it could be spoken out or written out, but basically the plan, the big overall vision plan of what you want to have happen. So if it's a project or some type of an event you want to put on, what is the purpose of all of that? That's clarity on a higher level. And then there's clarity down onto like the project level, like, okay, who's responsible for what? Like the tangible assets, the tangible program, the tangible things you're going to create, like who's going to do what do we have to create? What's the timeline to create it? So there's clarity on the plan. So you could almost say clarity is like a plan, but it's an overarching vision plan, and also the what, and then also the how, I think comes from, and quite frankly, the why might come from here too, because that might go into motivation a little bit, but the why gives everybody a clear vision of what we're trying to accomplish together and why it's important.
Yeah, I think just going through all of the standard who, what, when, why, how, like the when is the one that I missed. Where did I say where? All of those questions, like the standard, questions that you ask yourself, I think those all lead into clarity. Even if the why is a bit of motivation, that could be like why it's happening in general. That doesn't necessarily speak to your personal motivation about why you're doing it. But I think the clarity comes from being able to answer, okay, I'm going to try this again. Maybe I should have written this down. I'm going to try to get all of the basic storyteller questions in. But it would be who, what, where, when, why, and how. All right, so
good job.
Thank you. And I had to write them down as I went to make sure I didn't miss one. But it's just I don't know what those are called, but I think they're called the 5 W's and 1 H question, which is a very creative title for those questions. But once you can answer all of them, I think, or even if you can answer most of them, you have enough clarity to move forward. And again, sometimes with certain personality types, the challenge with clarity isn't that they're lacking clarity, it's that they're never satisfied with the amount of clarity they have. So I think it's also really knowing how much clarity is necessary to move forward and how much clarity is necessary to like if you don't have full clarity, sometimes that's okay, because oftentimes people calibrate as they go. And so what is enough clarity to feel comfortable, and what is just kicking the can down the road in perpetuity because you never feel quite ready?
I would say IJs top my list for people that probably never feel quite ready. And then IPs would be next, trying to make sure they have all the information often or all the right feelings before they move. And then probably EPs next, not maybe from a lack of feeling prepared, but just not wanting to cut off options. They want to, getting clarity means you got to get into action as an EP. So, and I would say probably EJs have probably some of the most clarity. At least they think they do. At least on that, they're just not holding them back. Let's put it that way. So then from clarity, we go down to motivation/desire. And I think desire is a strategy from the category of motivation. And from my standpoint, motivation is an internal thing too, just like permission. You can't really get that from outside yourself. And if you're a leader or a manager and you want people to do something on the team or have a goal to get accomplished, you have to find a way for them to feel motivated internally, feel the motivation you need them to feel. And that can be tricky, I think, when you're leading other people. When you're leading yourself, that can be tricky. It's hard to motivate ourselves, especially in our modern Western world. If you live in the West with all the modern conveniences of everything at your fingertips, life comes with a lot of ease for a lot of people. And I think that it's tough to get up off your couch and stop playing that video game and get out there and do something, or Stop delaying your life and get on track. Take that class you need to take, or that course you need to take, or that degree you want to start moving in the direction you want to go. That motivation can be really tough to get inside yourself, let alone help inspire other people to that motivation.
Yeah, weaving type into this, I think this is the biggest challenge for IPs. I think IP types have the biggest challenge with trying to figure out what their motivation is. And like you said, desire can be a subcategory or a strategy underneath this. Because I know that some people have a challenge with using certain emotions to motivate themselves, but it's not necessarily the healthiest emotion to use in those situations.
Are you putting that in air quotes because you're talking about me? Yeah. Some people use emotions that aren't the best to use.
I've heard tell of people doing that. I wouldn't know any of them by name, but apparently that's a thing that can happen. Well, my go-to motivation is anxiety. Right, exactly.
I've been wired that way since a little kid.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of funny that we, that I'm like, well, some people can do this. But the reason why I said that in a non-specific way wasn't because I was trying to preserve your feelings. It was more that I know that this is like a general rule of thumb. I think it's actually not just some people. I think it's a lot of people. A lot of people use different styles of negative, away from emotions and feelings to get motivated to do anything. Like the idea of being really anxious or creating fires, right? That's a motivation or motivational tactic that a lot of anxiety motivational users do, is that they'll generate a fire or a problem or challenge that has to be put out right away. And it gives them that hum of anxious energy to be able to apply to whatever it is they're doing. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily motivated to do that thing. It's that they're borrowing the energy they got from the anxiety and then applying it to something that they may or may not actually individually have any desire towards. It's just something that has to happen.
Yeah.
And so I think that motivation is one of those challenges that's like, well, how do you find a way to get motivated and stay motivated? And what's interesting is that I think you and I went back and forth on this a little bit because I'm a TP. And so I use introverted thinking. And for me, motivation is almost always linked to clarity. Once I feel clear about something, once I have clarity about the thing itself and how I'm going to go about it, oftentimes that's when I get excited by it. And so I get motivated. But I also recognize that those two things are very separate. I can have clarity about some things and still not be very motivated to do it because I don't have a desire to personally be involved in that thing. And so even though I'll have clarity around the subject, it doesn't speak to me as an individual. And so I just kind of think, well, I'll let somebody else handle that. So I think when it comes to me, sometimes it's a matter of sort of knocking some of these dominoes down in order to get excited for something that's a project that I have to do. But I know it's not a one-to-one correlation. Clarity does not always equal motivation, but it's really hard for me to be motivated without it. So I need to have it. It's like a component in it, but it's not a one-to-one.
Yeah, totally. I think of in Awaken the Giant Within, Tony Robbins' book, he basically boils down motivation to a binary system. I think it's oversimplified, but basically he talks about this idea that every action we take as humans, and I agree with him to most degrees here, we either do it to go toward something that's pleasurable or to avoid something that's painful. So it's either toward pleasure or away from pain. And it's been my experience that the away from pain motivation, for some reason, probably because it's tied more to our survival, pleasure is tied more to our thriving and pain is tied more to our surviving. So we want to avoid pain because that's an indicator of death or suffering or detriment. Like we're going to lose our lives and the lives of the people around us if we're in pain. Like pain signals that to us. So we try to avoid pain, and it's extremely powerful. I think most people, the majority of people, are motivated through the avoidance of pain over the desire for pleasure. I liken it to, well, we did this podcast a long time ago. It could have been 2 or 3 years ago. I don't remember when or which podcast it was. But we talked about this idea of, do you see life as a problem to solve, or do you see life as a game to optimize? That's the question we asked in this podcast, because we kind of made some distinctions around, I think we were talking about motivation or seeing life in a certain way. I don't even remember what the topic was of the podcast, but I remember having this conversation because this is how this little thing in my head runs all the time. Do I see life as a problem to solve when I'm stressed out and anxious? I'm like, well, how am I seeing life as a problem to solve? And the situations around me as a problem to solve. why am I not seeing it all as like a giant video game that I want to optimize, like min-max my character or like XP points, upgrade my levels? Like, why do I keep thinking of like, oh, there's this problem I've got to solve? I think it really roots down to the framework of the problem to solve is you're trying to avoid pain. You're trying to solve problems. You're trying to survive. And the idea of a game to optimize is working toward pleasure. It's moving towards something, that desire you talked about, Antonia, where you wire something you want as the thing that draws you forward. That's the game to optimize, the life that you can make the best life possible. And just that little framework has impacted my life in tons of ways in the past few years. Just keep that focus on the game to optimize over the problem to solve. And I still get pulled back into the problems I have to solve in life and in my own life and in life in general and culture at large. Like it's so seductive and compelling to be there. But I think that motivation, though, if we can wire it as humans toward a positive framework, I think we get more accomplished ultimately because it's always a desired thing. So I think the word desire is a great subcategory here. I think it matters a lot to actually moving the needle and creating that motivation within ourselves.
Yeah, I think too, I mean, that was all really beautiful, and I have something else that's not related to say about it.
Well, okay. Then why don't you say it?
Okay. I just realized I was going to be like, yeah, and also, and then I was going to say something that's not terribly related. But
it's related to motivation.
Yeah, it's related to motivation. Well, I was going to loop it back to type because I said at the beginning of this, I think IPs are the ones who probably struggle with motivation the most, probably followed by IJs. And if you're an introvert, it's hard to motivate yourself to do anything in the outer world. The outer world it's not your native land. It's not the place you want to spend the most time in. And so when you start a project, that means now you're committed to this project and you got to see it to its end ostensibly. And so I think IPs and IJs have some of the biggest challenges with motivation in the beginning. But I think as you go, as an EP, motivation can run out as you get into a project because you may have fueled yourself by the fun of it in the beginning. Oh, this is why what you said triggered me, is because you said, is it a problem you have to solve or a game to be optimized? And if you naturally think in terms of playing a game, then the challenge there becomes that when something stops being fun, then you want to stop doing it. It's now a problem to solve as opposed to a game to optimize. And so as you get into a project, and I think this can happen to EJs too. I know for EJ types, it feels really good to just check things off of a list and, mark them off. But I think that for EJs as well, but primarily for EPs, as you get into something, if it's not giving you a return on investment by doing it, it's really hard to stick with it. It's much easier to jump track, right? Or get distracted or go to something else. In the outside world, right? The motivation isn't about engagement in the outside world. That's already kind of a given, but it's about this one thing that you have to now focus on and complete. And so I think motivation is a timeline issue when it comes to projects. And as we mentioned in the beginning, you might have some of these dialed in at the beginning of the project, but then as the project goes, now suddenly some of this resource is gone, including motivation. And so I think what is important about what you're talking about is this idea of having a motivation strategy. What are you going to do when you lack motivation? What are you going to do when it starts running out? And we just did a podcast called Surrender to the Work. And for me, my motivation has become a couple things. Number one, presence, which is I'm here, I'm in my life. It's not going anywhere. It's not like I can will myself into a better future. I'm here. This is what I'm experiencing. And so I just have to do what I have to do here in the moment, right? I'm going to surrender to the work and be present and just do what I need to do. So it's almost like I don't think about it too hard. And the challenge is that for me, I'm like probably a lot of people who are similar to us in type, and maybe you, the listener, just a famous overthinker. Like I just tend to be this sort of debilitating overthinker. And I've learned that if I stop thinking so much, even though that's how I've identified and defined myself for a really long time, and I still enjoy thinking, so it's still a sport. So I'm going to do it in a gamified way. But in those moments when I'm just not really enjoying something very much and it ceases to feel fun and I know I still have to do it, I give myself permission to shut my brain off and just do the thing I need to do, right? Only apply as much brain wattage as the project at hand requires of me. And I just use brute force to finish it off. That's how we wrote the book. One of the things when we were going back and asking ourselves, what projects did we actually accomplish last year? Because it felt like we didn't accomplish as much as we wanted to. It's always that way. Well, we realized a huge amount of real estate had been applied to writing the book. And that went on, it felt like it went on for eternity. It didn't.
Rewriting the book.
And rewriting it.
And rewriting the book.
And editing it a million times and just all the things that went into it. And I think by the end of it, I think I'd read, it's a 450-page book. I think I read that book through and edited it through probably about easily 6 or 7 times.
Yeah.
And so I got to a point as an ENTP that I was like, if I have to sit down and edit this thing one more time, I would really love to just take me out. Just end it right now. Just end it. Because it was such grueling, introverted sensing, inferior work.
Line by line by line.
It was so painful. So keeping my motivation during that task was simply a matter of me just shutting off my brain and going, well, the part of me that gets to ask the question of whether or not I'm allowed to finish allowed to I don't know, just abandon it and go do something else. I'm just not giving that part of my brain permission to speak. All right, you don't get a voice at the table right now. Like, you have to shut up, and then when the project is done, then I'll let you back out and you can go, hey, do we really want to do this project? But by then the project will be done, and so it's over. So I think you have to understand how you operate. You have to understand, like, what are the time periods you have a tendency to start sabotaging yourself because you lack motivation. And then you've got to figure out something that you're going to do about it. Now, with you, Joel, you mentioned that in the past you've used anxiety. And I know that based on our relationship, I have indicated that you using anxiety to finish projects is not conducive to a healthy back and forth between you and me.
It's not sustainable.
It just isn't. Because I hate the feeling of anxiety. It's like it
just works so well. It just works so well. And so finding other ways to motivate, they're good, but it's such a useful tool.
Well, and that's what you struggled with, is if you're going to remove anxiety as a motivation, now it creates this vacuum. What are you going to fill it with? And you're looking at me not saying anything and just sort of nodding because I don't think you have an answer yet.
Well, I think it's for me as an ENFP, it's been getting into my introverted feeling and asking myself, what do I want to feel? How do I want this to look? What is it that I want? Goes back to your desire idea under motivation, right? What is it that I desire? And follow those desires. Now, it's not as organized as my anxiety tends to put me on track for, because my anxiety comes probably more from my tertiary or 10-year-old extroverted thinking part of me. And that's probably where I've anchored a lot of that. So I'm trying to let that go and get more into what is it that I want. So I don't want to go totally down the road just about my personality type, right? But I would say that it's been my experience that I have to figure out other ways to motivate myself besides anxiety, long story short. And I think I found a lot of those. And I don't think I'm alone, and I don't think my type is specific to the anxiety that I think a lot of people have anxiety that motivates them to do something. And you could just replace anxiety with an away from motivation, whatever that is. Get you up and moving, whether it's fear or avoidance of something. A lot of these things motivate us and put us into action around the things we don't want to have happen. And it's just kind of rewiring that to go, what is it that we do want to have happen? That's really the reframe or the shift that I've made personally. And I think a lot of people, not just ENFPs, can benefit from that shift, regardless of your type.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot of, it's a weird strategy. You've done it with anxiety. When I said you didn't have an answer, I mean, you don't have like a silver bullet like you had, like anxiety was your silver bullet. And I don't think you have a silver bullet. Now you have a cocktail of emotions that you have to pull on, which is a little more complex.
Takes more coordination and skill to do it.
And awareness and introspection. And yeah, absolutely. And I have noticed that we have a tendency as people to borrow energy to apply to other things. Like your anxiety, like you might not have even really cared about the project you were working on, but if you had to get it done, you'd create anxiety someplace else and borrow the energy to apply to that. And I have something similar when I have a project I have to get done that I'm not that interested in. I will make a controversial post on Facebook, something I know that will get a bunch of maybe some backlash and, and maybe even a conversation going between other people. And the whatever energy that I get from saying something controversial that gets people kind of arguing with me, I'll get the energy that gets created in that context, and then I'll borrow that energy and apply it to the project. So
this is why ENTPs are trolls so much.
I've wondered.
I just think ENTPs they troll so much in life, just kind of throwing prods out there, trying to get a hook, like, come on, just antagonistic,
Yeah, I've wondered if it's an unconscious strategy to get the energy that's created in social discord, like that kind of sort of amps you up a little bit, and then take that energy and, borrowed energy and apply it to something that you don't really want to do. And I think the worst trolls are the ones that hate life the most. They're the ones that don't
have anything to do, maybe.
Well, no, I think they have things to do. I mean, it's like, it doesn't matter who you are. You got to chop wood and carry water, right? Like, you got to make your life happen. For the most part, I guess there are some people who have the ability to just do, absolutely nothing with their lives, and somehow the universe has granted them that. But I think that's a really insecure position to be in too, because that, we go post-apocalyptic and you're screwed. You don't know how to do anything. I mean, I'm screwed post-apocalyptic too, because all I know how to do is talk about personality types, and I don't think that's going to be valuable in Mad Max, future. But
the zombies don't care about that.
Yeah, they don't really care about that. But maybe I'll have some skill built and developed to be able to work my way through. But if you have literally no developed skills, then you're kind of screwed. So that makes you feel insecure. But that said, I think that the types that are the biggest trolls are oftentimes the one that are trying to sort of borrow the energy that gets generated in social discord and then apply it to the boringness or the mundaneness of the rest of their lives, which is why we have an instinct to say to trolls, get a life, right? You have nothing going on. So regardless of what it is, though, sort of looping back around to the original purpose is that there's a lot of struggles with motivation, and they might be things that are, like it's a timeline conversation, meaning that there might be moments in which you thought you had motivation for the project, but then all of a sudden it's gone. And keeping your finger on the pulse of that, I think, is big when your project is starting to fall flat. To go, okay, what's going on here? Do I still have permission? Yeah, I got permission. I know, I have personal permission to accomplish this, and even outer world permission, right? My boss told me that I'm allowed to do it or whatever. And I have clarity. I know the who, what, where, when, why, and how. But I'm maybe lacking the motivation, or I've used up all my motivation. Maybe I used up all my energy, and now, like, I just kind of don't care anymore, or I just don't want to apply anymore to it. So keep your finger on the pulse of that, and keep your finger on the pulse of when you have a tendency to lose motivation, and keep your finger on the pulse of the strategies you use to keep motivation and how you borrow it, and maybe that's burnt out, and then figure out what your personal path is for keeping motivated. The next one is skill, right? So in order to accomplish a project, you have to have the skill to be able to do it. Otherwise, it's just an exercise in frustration. Now, we talk a lot about flow at Personality Hacker. We reference the book Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi a lot because we like the concept and the idea of it. And flow usually gets us into a zone where all of a sudden we've accomplished all this stuff and it felt like 45 minutes and it ended up being 4 hours. So flow is a very powerful tool to apply to projects or anything you're doing. But flow requires you to be doing something that is just a little outside your skill set, right? Just a hair outside your skill set, because it creates enough like you have enough to be able to accomplish it if you put just a little bit more of yourself into it, which keeps it interesting. It's a little challenging, but it's exhilarating because you're doing it and you tested yourself and you succeeded. So that's the formula. It's one of the components for the formula of flow. But if something is way outside of your skill level and you just cannot do it at all, it doesn't put you into flow. It does the opposite. It just makes you upset and frustrated. So if you are working on a project and you find yourself just in, it's just churning in perpetuity, a lot of times it's because you don't necessarily have the skill or the competence to do it. Now, we also recorded a podcast on what we called the Stephen Covey's competence model, right? Is that what the podcast was called? And
yeah.
So the Stephen Covey's competence model. And one would think, well, we should know whether or not we have the skill to accomplish a project, right? Like that should just be intuitive. Like, yes, I can do that. No, I can't do that. But the challenge is that most of us don't want to know how incompetent we are. And we can be living in a world or the quadrant in that model called unconscious incompetence, which is that we have no idea what goes into making this thing happen, a project happen or something happen or whatever. We have no idea, but we aren't aware enough of our lack of competence, and because it's unconscious for us. And so we might end up getting ourselves in projects where we're like, I can totally do that. And we've bitten off way more than we can chew. And then now we struggle to even see that about ourselves because our ego has to take a hit. So I think when it comes to projects and churn, one of the big things we can do is familiarize ourselves with the competence model and go, okay, so am I entering something that is a modest, this is a modest decision for me. Like I have commensurate skill level or competence to be able to accomplish this, or it's just a little outside of my skill set. And so I'll just have to push myself, thereby keeping it more interesting and challenging and, ostensibly putting me into flow.
I think one of the other things here too is how specialized our world has become. So a lot of people have skill, but it's so specialized in that skill, or they have, like, let's say you want to develop something like, let's say you want to do a graphic design business, right? So you spend a lot of time on developing the skill of graphic design. You have the motivation, you have the clarity, the permission, and you work really hard on building up your graphic design skills, but you haven't built up the skills of like how to market yourself or get onto some platform to get the work you need. And so like not all skills are created equal. There's like a layer of skills you have to have under the skill that you're developing that's like specific and high level. There's other things that are almost like life skills we stack over time. This is why experience matters so much. I'm sure if you're in the job market right now, you listening, and you're trying to get a job, like the most frustrating thing on the planet is like, you have to have 10 years experience in this field that's only 3 years old. And it's like, wait, what? Like, how am I supposed to have all this experience? I'm just out of college, or I'm trying to find a job for the first time, or I'm switching careers. And like, you have to have an entry point, right? And it's almost like these ridiculous requirements, like, we'll only hire you if you have this experience. And we don't want to pay a lot because it's entry level, but it's like, how am I supposed to break into that thing? Anyway, long story short, I'm sure you've had that experience where there's like other factors that go into play. That's why the employers, they're looking for something they may not even be clear about what they're looking for. They're looking for like almost this underpinning of experience below the specific skill, and working in that field for 5 or 10 years or whatever number they throw out on that job description is typically a call for all the other intangible qualities that they can't list out on a job description that they're looking for, that metric of time somehow means something to them.
Like institutional knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like how things work. Like I remember running a graphic design office at the zoo I used to work at a long time ago. And I think we shared the story recently on a podcast where graphic designers came in from the colleges as interns, and they were great designers. I mean, beautiful artwork, beautiful designs, great layouts. It was just fantastic. But then it was like, okay, we got to package this for print to send to the printer. What do you mean package this for print? I have no idea what you're talking about. And because you have to collect all the different assets that are part of that design, put them into a folder, zip that folder, and get it to the printer. There's a specific way you have to do that so that all the resolution and everything goes with that, the graphic that you designed, basically. And it was something you don't really like learn in college because it was designed specifically, or it's a functionality of something outside of that specific skill set. It's interfacing with the printer, the print shop, or where that design needs to be, the ad agency or whatever. And I remember that was really clear to me in that context. Wow, there's like an underpinning of experience here. As talented as these kids are that are coming out of college that are in this program, they're missing a couple little just experiential things. And so I think skill can be expanded upon not just the thing you're trying to accomplish, but what are the other career capital skills that you should be building too, just in general in your life, that will underpin the specific skills. And that's something else I think that we tend to forget. I don't want to belabor that too much because it's really not applicable to the model, but that's just something. If like you like, I have the skill, why won't I have permission? I've got clarity, desire, motivation. I've got the resource. I even have the skill. Why is it not happening? Well, do you actually have all the skill you need? And make sure you're really looking at that, examining that as you're determining the skills that you have that are not just the specific skill. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to figuring out why you're in the middle of a project churn, sometimes I think that one's the biggest ego hit. Right? Like the permission piece is usually us working through our ego to get to the other side to go, okay, I'm allowed to do this. I'm allowed to engage in the world. And clarity isn't about ego usually. Clarity is just about how it's going to happen, right? It's like all the particulars. And motivation, it might be about ego, but usually motivation is one of those things where it's like, I'm just not motivated. And most of us know that that's something that happens. But the competency skill thing is sometimes hard for us to really be accurate around. Because it requires a little bit of an ego hit if we go, okay, maybe I don't have the skill to do this. And then it's a matter of trying to figure out how to get that skill. Do I, subcontract it out? Do I hire somebody else that has the skill? Do I, go train with somebody to get it? Like, what exactly do I have the motivation to do all that, or do I just drop the project at this point? Like, I think that one requires a little bit of humility from us as well.
And I think bringing type into it, I don't see a real distinction about the ability to build skill between type. It's just how you probably will build skill depending on your type. So different types will approach this differently, but it isn't like with IPs, and the motivation piece. It's not like there's a specific type that has a challenge with skill. I think everybody needs to learn skill. It's just how we go about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the final one, we always say that these are going to be like 30-minute podcasts, and I'm sure this thing is drug out to an hour or more. We're like, let's just record a quick one. I don't think quick ones exist for us anymore.
No.
I remember a long time ago reading a review on Amazon, or excuse me, on iTunes about our podcast, I think in like the very first year in 2014. And the very first podcast were like 20, 30 minutes. And somebody said way back in 2014, they're like, well, 4 stars instead of 5 because they seem to be getting longer without any specific application. And I remember looking back on that like years later, I'm like, wow, that person's probably no longer listening to us because we've got some like 90-minute podcasts out there. And I have no idea if there's application anywhere. You'll have to figure out how to apply it yourself. But that said, let's go into the 5th and final bullet point here, which is the concept of resource. In order to get any project done, you have to have the resource for it. And resource can be monetary, it can be capital, it can be energy, it can be mental real estate. So I was trying to figure out why I didn't get this project done last year. And as we were ruminating over the year and trying to figure out why didn't we get this done, like the number one big thing that came out of last year for me anyway, 2 huge things came out. The first one is the book. And then the second one was that we ran some live events and they were beautiful. We did a 5-day retreat, or a 4-day retreat. It was gorgeous. It was just like fantastic. And we did a 5-day live event for Profile Training. Both of them were great. And we looked at each other. I mean, a whole team just is on fire when we do these. And afterwards, we're like, yep, this is what we're made to do, live events. So now we just really want to hit live events hard in the next year. But we can't do that at the beginning of the year because we've got this other project that we didn't finish last year. And so we're so frustrated. We got to kick the can of live events to the latter half of the year because we have to do this major project. And so I was like, why didn't I get this done? And I'm like kind of mentally kicking myself. And then I realized the book it was an albatross around my neck. It occupied so much mental and emotional real estate. So the resource of attention was not there. I just couldn't give it to this other project. And this other project is related. So, I mean, because it's type-based, right? This other project is type-based and the book is type-based. So obviously there's going to be a lot of crossover. So I thought, well, it's just really easy to get this other thing done because I'm working on the book and I got all this type stuff in my head. So I'll just apply it to this other thing. But I could barely touch this other thing over there because all of my mental real estate had been completely gobbled up by the book. Now the book is done. There's a sense of freeness and elation that is hard to articulate now that this behemoth is over. And now I feel like, yeah, I really can hit this project hard because I have all this real estate opened up. And that was the first time I realized how much attention is a resource in getting things done. How much just being able to apply my, mental focus to something is a major resource. So I think the reason why I'm mentioning that is because I think the other resources are obvious. Do I have the capital for it? Do I have the time for it? Do I have the tools for it? Tools are a resource as well. So do I have the right tools for the job? But the one that was squirmy for me, and I didn't really understand how much it really applied, was this concept of focus and attention.
I would resonate with everything you just said. And I don't mean to hijack the conversation more back to a meta level on the entire model.
Go for it.
But if you have more to say about resource, we can come back to it. But resource reminds me of so what was coming up for me as you talked about this is all of these factors have to be in place, and you could also have too much of one of these things. So like when I was a teenager, I went into photography. This was way back in the day before you could have digital cameras, right? It was like film cameras. I had my own dark room. It was like this big thing, black and white photography. And I remember reading a lot of photography books talking about how when you go out and you shoot, one of the things you can do to instill really great creativity is limit the amount of equipment you take in the field. Like pick one lens and one type of film, like pick black and white, don't take black and white in color, pick one type of film and pick one lens, go out in the field and shoot all day with that one lens with one type of film. And the limitation of resource, you don't have like 6 different lenses to have to think, okay, which lens am I going to use? You have one lens with you, and that's the only lens you can use. And the limitation of resource actually allowed me to become a really good photographer because I actually went out and took pictures because I wasn't like trying to guess and estimate what I'm going to do all the time. That was already pre-decided for me. So the resource was limited. It actually empowered me to go out and take more pictures and then come home and develop them at the end of the day and get better at my craft over time. And I just realized that probably that same principle applies to all of these things, right? You said earlier, I'm going to go back to what you said when you were talking, I think, about motivation, Antonia, where you talked about you wouldn't give yourself permission to not work on the book. So it was a limitation of permission that allowed you to get that thing done. So when I talk about these are the things you need, or when we talk about these are the things you need, it's not necessarily you have to have all these dialed up to 100. Some of them you want to dial down in order to actually make the project happen, because giving yourself too much permission with the book, you would have just taken time off and not gotten it done. Oh, I got permission, I can do this later, but you didn't give yourself permission. So it's about the category of permission, the category of resource, the category of clarity. Sometimes, I'm sure there's different personality types, we can talk about this too, where more clarity will actually confuse getting a project done. Like more clarity is not what you need. It actually gums up the works because now it opens up more loops. It opens up more like things like limitation of what you're seeing, like lack of clarity actually could get something done better, right? And there's probably a bunch of these. So it's more of a balance on the category level of the threshold of how much you need or how much you're withholding from yourself, and knowing when that toggle switch needs to be pushed from one direction to the other. When do you need to give yourself more permission? And when do you need to tell yourself you don't have permission for something?
Right. Like I think that's a great point, because taking the category of skill or competence, if you have too much skill for something, you might not do it because it's too boring and you feel like somebody else should handle that, not you. And so, yeah, I think that's accurate. And I think when it comes to resource, one of the nice things about not having enough resource, like a little bit, again, it's just a hair's breadth less than or about, or over. But I think having just a little less resource than you need makes you resourceful. And sometimes it makes the project come out better because you had to figure something out. You had to be creative and get around, whatever is the obstacle, the resource obstacle. You had to kind of create something new, something that you didn't think that you'd be able to do. And then the project, has like a better result or output. So I think you're right. I think as with everything, it's a matter of figuring out that tension point, right? What's too much, too little. We talk about tension points a lot, I think, because it's a really relevant thing in our life right now, is this idea of tension points and not too much and not too little, and sort
balance.
of balance and sort of finding what is the right tension point between all of this. And I agree. I mean, it sounds like, oh my gosh, projects will take 1 million years because I have to think about all this stuff. And again, I think we're giving this model not because this is your checklist before you say yes to anything, but more if you find yourself unable to accomplish something, there might be an element of what we're talking about that is the obstruction to getting the thing done.
Good models are flexible and can be expanded infinitely, and also be boiled down to their simple elements that can be used quickly. And for this model, I think we're talking about some of the more nuance of maybe balance and tension points and not giving yourself permission, giving yourself like in different contexts. But let's circle back around to the simplicity of the model, in that if you're stuck in something, if you listening right now are working on a project, you're trying to move something forward in your life or with a team or lead other people to an objective end, what are you missing from this list? It's a great place to start, right? Probably getting into all the nuance of maybe I shouldn't give myself permission or maybe I should limit my resource. Let's just take all that off the table for a second just to be able to apply this. And how can we apply this as we can give a couple examples here, how to look at this in a lens just from our own experiences or people close to us. And then you can start to take this and apply it in your life potentially. And then we can expand it and work on this model to see if there's other elements that could come into play and how to think about it. So I think of a friend of ours. She went to university in England. She just got she's in the last stages of her PhD. She's written her dissertation. She's got everything lined up. I think she's given her oral defense, or she still has to. I can't remember.
No, she's given it.
So she's already done this. So now the last stage is for her to spend about, I think she was telling us 8 to 10 hours of corrections and adjustments to her dissertation. And then it's published and it's done and she finishes the program. And it's like 8 hours of work total. It's just like technical detail work.
After like a decade.
Yeah, she's been spending years. She got her undergrad, her master's, her PhD at like Cambridge. Like she was like gone all the way at a very advanced, like I think it's a
field she basically is helping invent, actually.
Yeah, so it's like this really abstract, intuitive field, a lot of psychology courses. Like it was really difficult to get here. And she's down to the last 8 hours of work. And she was confessing to us, she's like, I just can't seem to do it. Like, I don't know, like, it's not getting done. Like, I just...
Months. It's been months.
Yeah, she doesn't have any external pressure, and so she's not getting it done. And so I would look at her and go, okay, like, if I was talking to her and we were trying to diagnose this, just as an example, I'd go, okay, does she lack permission? Doesn't feel like she can make those corrections? Does she lack clarity? Does she not know which corrections to make? Does she lack motivation, like the gumption, the drive to do it? Does she lack the skill? I don't think so, because she's got, she went through all this coursework. It sounds like she'd have the skill to make these corrections. She wrote the paper from scratch. Does she miss the resource? Does she not like have a word processor or a computer or pens and papers to be able to make these adjustments, right? Is she lacking resource in some way, or the time or attention she could give to it? And the only one that I could come down just from this example is the motivation. For some reason, it feels like everything else is in place there, but there's this motivation holdback that is not allowing that to get done.
Well, and if I didn't know this person, if I was just talking about it in the abstract, or if I had heard about it, actually permission would be the number one that jumps out to me.
Okay.
Because it's permission to end this chapter of life and move on to whatever's next.
So it's almost as knowing that once this is over, I got to get onto the next thing.
Right. And it's the permission to transition, or the permission to like see yourself as like she'll be a doctor. Like, is she dealing with any permission issues around that? Like, should I, because I would imagine if I was getting my PhD, something that might come up for me is man, your chair is so loud. Every time you move and it squeaks. I would think, I think, what is the phrase, imposter syndrome? We've talked about imposter syndrome. I don't experience imposter syndrome anymore because I'm too solipsistic for that. But I could imagine somebody getting their doctorate, like maybe there's permission issues going around it. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting list to go through and go, okay, what's going on for me? Why am I dragging this thing out? Why can't I just sort of land the plane?
Sure. And then I think in terms of, you could use this in your life with your children or your family. So like I look at one of my sons, maybe I've given them a directive, like go clean your room, and it doesn't get done. And so then I look down this little checklist. I go, did they have permission to clean their room? Yeah. Was there clarity about what I wanted? Yes. Was there motivation? Maybe that's what's missing. Was there skill? Well, maybe that's missing. Maybe I haven't taken time as a dad to show my son how to like vacuum the floor or clean the room or something, right? Or is there a resource missing? Maybe they didn't have access to rags or vacuums or whatever they needed to clean their room, right? Clean sheets or whatever else. So it's like a little list. You can go through any level of things that are stopping you for yourself or people in your life. Do you have any other examples before we close out?
No, I think you gave 2 beautiful examples.
All right. I try to always think in terms of something practical we can grab a hold of and then go use. And I'd love to hear what you've come up with as far as taking this little model. Like, just think about something right now that you're frustrated around, or it's like it's stalled out in your life. Just run down this little checklist. Like, what are you missing from that? I'd love to hear about it over at our website, personalityhacker.com. You can leave a comment or ask a question, leave some feedback about this little model. What have you taken away from it? Directly below the show in the comment field, leave your voice. We want to know what's going on for you, your story, what's resonating with you here. Where would this checklist break down? Where can you see its usefulness? Is there anything else that needs to be added to it? Or can we boil it down even more? Is it too long of a list? I don't know.
Is it redundant?
I mean, I'm trying to think in terms of this. I feel like it's a pretty good list of getting some stuff done.
I think I know why we didn't talk about this before, because the challenge is coming up for me right now. We haven't named it. And sometimes when we don't name a model, we won't talk about it because we feel like we have to put a name to it. And we don't have a name. So once again, we're running into, what do we call this podcast? This has become a game for us. What do we title this podcast? I don't know. I guess we'll find out. You'll already know because you, the listener, will already know because it will already have been titled. But now we got to figure this out. So if you have, we'll probably name it something generic. And then if you have an elegant name for it, let's crowdsource that too. Call it something cool.
That'd be cool.
Yep.
So we need to wrap this up. I think this model is great for you to use in your life. I'm starting to use it a lot, just asking myself these questions. And it's been very powerful for us in our lives. Leave your feedback. You can also find us on all the different social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Find us, subscribe, be a part of that community as well, because that's growing all the time. And that's a lot of times we announce where we're going to be, live events, and different aspects of what's coming up next is going to be out on social media. So make sure you subscribe and get a hold of all that. And then also the video and the content we're going to be putting out this year as well is going to come through those channels.
Yep, absolutely. And the live meetups and all that stuff. If you enjoy this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. Leave a rating and review for us on iTunes. It helps us out a ton. Go buy the book. How's that?
That was direct. I love it.
Go buy the book. And I think the reason why I'm saying that so assertively is because I was reminded of the hell it was to get through a 450-page book. Don't let that turn you off, though. It's a quick read, I think.
Well, because it's divided up by types. So the first part is talking about the system, breaking down the Myers-Briggs system and the cognitive functions. And then there's 16 chapters, one for every type. And you don't have to read all the way through those. You could read your type chapter.
Yeah.
And then the end is a conclusion. So it actually could be a quick read.
It could be a quick read. Or the type chapters of all the people in your life and your loved ones. And then that concludes with the firm model, our proprietary model, which we've done a podcast about, but there's more content and information in the book. So go buy the book, go check it out, and then leaving us a rating and review on Amazon for the book. That also helps us out.
And it costs about, 2 burritos at Chipotle? That's about the cost of the book.
It's a 2 burrito value for you.
If you're like, man, I just don't have enough to buy this book, just think in terms of, I'll just fast off of 2 burritos in the next month, and those 2 burritos could go into the book.
Yeah, I think your colon will thank you too. So it's a 2 burrito colon thanking value to go buy the book. So that's our recommendation.
My name is Joel Markwitt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.